You're listening to Coast Business Radio with Mike Ryan.
Senator Malcolm Roberts from Pauline Hanson's One Nation has a strong interest in economics and is also passionate about climate change data. Malcolm's climate investigations led to a deep understanding of foreign control in Australia and on disadvantages of our tax system. He believes strongly in individual initiative and responsibility to build strong economic, social and community structures. Malcolm, welcome.
Hi there, Mike. Thank you very much for having me as a guest.
Is one of the greatest stumbling blocks to economic prosperity our cost structure and energy prices?
It is one of the greatest, but it's not the greatest. I led Australia's largest underground coal mining project back in the 90s. And we developed a philosophy that was unique. And I've understood for many years now that the philosophy is what drives something. What I believe is our biggest detraction at the moment from economics, a successful economy, is the role of government. Government has no longer serving the people. Instead, government has been reversed in its roles, and the people are serving the government. We've got onerous regulations that are over the top. We've got red, green and blue tape that are choking the country. We've got a tax system that is highly destructive towards Australian businesses and Australian families. We've got, as I said, over-regulation. We've got a dearth of data, and instead we're run on opinions and guesses and lies, and I mean that sincerely, lies, literally. We're run on a lack of courage and a lack of integrity. So these things are by far the bigger picture, because government's role, I believe, Mike, is to create an environment in which people can thrive. That's where the engine room of an economy.
Are you fearful or worrisome about the, I am, COVID-19 with all these restrictions, because people in power don't like to give that power back?
I am worried to some extent, and we have been really watching that very, very closely. We've been calling the government out, and especially the state government, on that. Mike, it's really important, going back to your first question, that a virus, it spreads through human interactions. An economy and economic health and growth depends on human exchanges and interactions. So when we clamp people down by locking away the human interactions, by preventing those human interactions, we choke the economy, which is what we're seeing. What has happened is that there's been a complete reverse of what's needed. Now, I applaud the government's strong stance initially on protecting lives. That's essential. And I came out very strongly because I was worried that the government and politicians in Australia generally are worried about taking a position that may be wrong. So I said, no, there's too much risk. We have to come out hard on this. But what we have done is we've isolated the wrong people. Instead of isolating everyone, we need to isolate the right people, which is the sick people and the vulnerable people, which is what's happened in Taiwan. And Taiwan has hardly missed a beat in its economy. And Taiwan has only 6 fatalities in a population of 24 million that was under more pressure from the virus initially than was Australia. So they have done much better in protecting their population, so much better in protecting their economy and therefore their people in the future. And it's important to know that when you destroy an economy, that creates death 2 or 3 years down the road because of all kinds of pressures and stresses that manifest in the health system. So I am worried about the freedom, and governments, as you quite rightly point out, don't want to let go, but I'm also worried about the economic impacts of isolating the wrong people.
Interesting, the ANZ and also NAB are quite fearful of the future. The restrictions that were put in place are now going to damage the economy. What would you have done?
I would have, instead of just looking to Britain, which is where our medical people looked for guidance in this and a model of what an epidemic does, I would have looked around many countries, and in particular the countries in East Asia, Taiwan and Hong Kong notably, but also South Korea. And I would have done that because they have had the experience of the SARS epidemic. They're ready. And we need to recognize that Taiwan in particular, and also Hong Kong, has done a remarkable job. They've protected their people even better than we have. And I think we have to give credit to the government for eventually coming out strongly and closing our borders fairly early and looking after our people. But Taiwan, as I said a minute ago, has hardly missed a beat. South Korea is another really interesting example. South Korea got out of control early, and they recognized that. They started following down the Italian path. And then they clamped down, but they didn't clamp down on their people. They clamped down on testing, and they trusted the people. And so South Korea very quickly got on top. And even though they had a very poor start, they quickly flattened their curve. So South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, they are the model, and they didn't take notice of the British doctors. They developed their own experience. So I would have listened and looked more widely and got many more people involved. Now, it's difficult to do that, so I've got to be careful here because, as I've said in the Senate twice now, the government has no manual for doing this.
Malcolm, I'm just wondering what's happened to business of late. Before we had the activist, and they were out there, and then you had business, they were there. It's sort of hard to distinguish who's who. I mean, look at the Business Council of Australia and other business groups with, say, pro-zero emissions, energy prices, windmills, as Donald calls it. Is this more emotional than science or good sense?
It's definitely not good sense for Australia. You raise a really important point there, Mike, because our large industry groups, the BCA, Business Council of Australia, Australian Industry Group, the Chamber, there's another one I can't think of at the moment. You can best illustrate their positions by looking at Heather Ridout, who was in charge of one of those groups some years ago during Julia Gillard's prime ministership. Heather Ridout could see the uncertainty caused by the demand for a carbon tax from the Labor and the Greens parties. So she said, what we need to do is to remove that uncertainty by bringing in a carbon tax. How absolutely stupid can you be? That, in my opinion, is a completely dishonest position. Some while later, Heather Ridout was rewarded by the Gillard government by being made a director of the Reserve Bank of Australia. A lot of this business is self-serving. So it's not just the individuals who are failing to represent industry in Australia, but they're representing, in some cases, and this gets me annoyed because so many of our large companies are foreign-owned. And the Business Council of Australia speaks for foreign-owned companies because they pay the dues, they pay the bills, they pay the piper. And that's what's wrong with the Business Council of Australia and business groups. They're run to suit a few large companies that are mostly foreign-owned. And they go against Australia's interests. And in particular, look at tax. Since 1953, and I use these words, I'm quoting from the Deputy Commissioner of Taxation in 1996 and in 2010, the same man, he retired around about 2015. His name was Jim Kalali. He said that since 1953, 90% of Australia's large companies are foreign-owned, and since 1953 have paid little or no tax. And these people want to prolong that. And that's what makes business so difficult in this country, and that's why these self-serving people are looking after the large foreign-owned companies at the cost of everyday Australians, at the cost of families, and the cost of Australian business. It makes it so much harder for Australian businesses to compete when they're behind the eight ball 30% to start with before they even turn a dollar.
Just as an example, the excise duties, truly outrageous, and it's having an effect on the microbreweries and anybody into wine production. So you're right, we really need to revisit the whole kit and caboodle, don't we?
You're absolutely right, Mike. Taxation system is the most destructive system in this country. I have three most destructive. The most destructive political force in the country is the Greens Party. The most destructive building is Australia's federal Parliament House, and by that I mean the people within, the politicians and the bureaucrats, because they've lost touch and they no longer serve the people. But the third thing is the most destructive system, and that is our taxation system. It hits the wrong people. It's very, very harsh. It's punitive. It's just cobbled together mess, and it's not at all what we need. And there are so many areas that we need to prune. And in fact, I think the best thing that we need to do is to start again from the ground up, based upon principles and a philosophy of serving the country. Now, when I first entered the Senate, I pulled Senator Matthias Cormann aside for a minute and said, Matthias, can I talk with you? And he said, sure, mate. So I said, look, when are we going to do something about tax in this country? Oh, no, too difficult. That was it. So we will continue to beat that drum, though, because tax drives all kinds of counterproductive behaviours in this country, uncompetitive behaviours with regard to our international competitiveness, and is just an onerous impediment. But it's not just taxes. And tell me if I'm talking too much here, because I get fired up on this. It's not just taxes. It's also all the rates, the fees, the levies, the surcharges. Now, Joe Hockey, when he was Treasurer under Tony Abbott's government, he said that 50%, the tax rate for most people in Australia is 50%. And he said, in graphic terms, that means people work from January to the end of June just to pay taxes. There were figures, and I haven't been able to trace these down, I haven't put much effort into it, but I know fairly reliably there were figures, I think it was from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, that said at that time, Mike, 68% of the income from a person earning the average income, which these days is about $80,000, 68% is paid to governments in taxes, rates, fees, levies, charges, special charges. That means that we've been fed a line about the biggest cost of our life will be our house. Absolute rubbish. The biggest cost of our life is government. And that's why we continually question and hold accountable the government, because we're not getting value for money because the government is not serving us.
Interesting points. We could go on forever, and we haven't got forever, Malcolm. But just in summary of the whole thing, issues with government, issue with the taxation system, will that ever change? If we look at the structure of politics in the last, since the 1950s, early 50s, we've had two dominating parties, the Labor Party and the Liberal Party. I look at our productive capacity in this country. It has been destroyed by subservience to foreign treaties, mainly with the United Nations. We have, in 1990, the government provided a list of 7,000 treaties that constrain us. We've lost our sovereignty. We've lost our economic sovereignty. We've lost our good governance. We've become interdependent, which is exactly what the UN wanted. But when you're interdependent, Mike, it means we're dependent on each other, which means we're dependent. Australia used to be independent once, not interdependent, independent. And we had a thriving manufacturing, a thriving primary sector, and a growing tertiary sector. We've lost that. And Australia needs to come back to being independent. And so the most important thing of all is truth and the need to understand that government's role is to serve the people, and the government best serves the people by making sure the business environment is appropriate and enables true investors, true businessmen, small, large, it doesn't matter, to serve people by meeting their needs. And government can never understand that, but business people do. In each sector, people develop enormous capacity for understanding what the market wants, and that is what we need to get back to. Creating an environment in this country that serves business, to enable business to employ people, to enable good wages, to enable security and low risk in the future. That's what we need to get back to. Independent Australia.